The old harbor smelled like rust and low tide, the kind of smell that clings to your coat for days after. Nora had learned to navigate the waterfront district by sound. The groan of the fishing boats against their moorings, the distant clang of the cannery that never seemed to close, the particular silence that meant the tide was going out. She was 11 years old, and she knew this part of Halifax the way most kids know their own backyards, because for her, it was. She lived with her grandmother in the narrow house above the bait shop on Connolly Street, a house that listed slightly to the left, as if it had grown tired of standing straight. Her grandmother, Agnes, had worked the cannery for 31 years before her hip gave out. Now she mended nets for the fishing crews at $2 per meter, her hands moving with the automatic confidence of someone who had done something so long it had stopped requiring thought. Nora helped when she could, after school, on weekends, during the long grey Nova Scotia winters when the light disappeared before supper, and Agnes's arthritis made her fingers lock up like old machinery. They didn't talk much about Nora's mother. She had left when Nora was 4, following someone west, and the postcards had stopped coming around the time Nora started grade 1. Agnes never said anything bitter about it. She just quietly became everything. Grandmother, mother, teacher, anchor. The way certain women do when life asks more of them than anyone should have to give. That Tuesday in late October, Nora had been walking the back route home along the waterfront, the longer way, the way she preferred when she needed to think. She'd had a difficult day, a test she hadn't prepared for. A comment from a girl at school about her jacket, last year's, from the church donation box, slightly too large in the shoulders. She was cutting through the old Meridian Wharf property, the decommissioned loading dock that the city had been threatening to develop for years without ever actually doing anything about it, when she heard it. A sound, not the boats, not the cannery, something else entirely, a low, rhythmic knock, barely audible beneath the wind. She stopped. The knock came again, 3 times, deliberate, from somewhere to her left, where a row of industrial shipping containers sat rusting against the chain-link fence. Nora stood very still. Every sensible instinct told her to keep walking. Agnes had raised her to be cautious, to be smart, to understand that a girl alone near the waterfront at dusk had no business investigating strange sounds. She took 3 steps toward the containers. The knocking was coming from inside the last one. A blue container, its paint peeling off in long curls, a padlock securing the doors. She pressed her ear against the metal and heard, beneath the knocking, something else, a sound that drove every other thought out of her head. Someone was breathing. "Hello," she said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. Silence. Then the knocking stopped, replaced by what she could only describe as desperate movement, someone shifting, repositioning, throwing themselves against the metal wall. "Is someone in there?" A muffled sound. Not words, something blocked. Nora looked around. The wharf was empty. The light was going. She reached for her phone and realized, with a sinking feeling she recognized from every inconvenient moment of her life, that the battery had died sometime during the walk home. She looked at the padlock. It was old, the same corroded kind that held the gate on the school's storage shed, the kind that had given out when the janitor pushed it wrong one February morning. She looked around until she found what she needed, a length of rebar lying half buried in the gravel. It took her 4 tries, the metal cold and slick in her hands, but on the 4th try the lock hasp gave way, and the container doors swung open. The smell hit her first, then her eyes adjusted. A man lay on the floor of the container, his hands bound behind him with zip ties, his mouth sealed with a wide strip of duct tape, his suit, and it was a suit, dark gray, clearly expensive, torn at both knees and darkened with what she understood was blood. He was older, maybe her teacher's age, maybe older than that. His hair was dark with streaks of gray at the temples. His eyes, when they found hers, were wild with an emotion she couldn't immediately name. Then she understood. It wasn't fear. It was relief so overwhelming it looked almost like grief. She pulled the tape from his mouth as gently as she could manage, which wasn't very gently at all, and he made a sound that she would remember for the rest of her life, a long, shuddering exhale, like a man surfacing from underwater. "Thank you," he said. His voice was ruined, barely a whisper. "Thank you." His name, she learned later, was Graham Whitfield. In Halifax, the name meant something. Whitfield Marine Holdings, 3 generations of shipbuilding, the kind of old money that doesn't advertise itself because it doesn't need to. He had been missing for 41 hours. The people who found him, following Nora's frantic run to the nearest open business, a Vietnamese grocery 2 blocks away whose owner let her use the phone, were a paramedic named Joel and 2 RCMP officers who arrived with their lights on. They wrapped Graham Whitfield in a thermal blanket and loaded him onto a stretcher, and one of the officers crouched down to Nora's level and asked her name, and when she told him, he wrote it carefully in his notebook. She walked home in the dark and told Agnes everything, and Agnes sat very quietly for a long moment before reaching across the kitchen table and covering Nora's hands with her own. "You did right," Agnes said. That was all. But the way she said it made Nora feel like something had shifted, though she couldn't have said what or how. Graham Whitfield had been abducted from the parking structure beneath his office building by 2 men who had since been identified and were already the subject of an active investigation. The motive, the papers reported, was a business dispute. A contract for the new offshore energy platform, money measured in tens of millions. A competitor who had decided that the cleanest solution to losing a bid was the removal of the man who won it. The plan had been to keep Graham until certain documents were signed over. When he refused, they'd run out of ideas and, apparently, nerve. They had left him in the container and gone quiet. He had been 41 hours from dying of dehydration and hypothermia when Nora found him. She didn't see him again for 3 weeks. When he came, it was not in the way she expected. No formal visit, no press, no cameras. A dark blue car parked on Connolly Street on a Thursday afternoon, and Graham Whitfield climbed out alone, carrying nothing, wearing a coat that was noticeably less expensive than the one he'd probably been wearing the night he disappeared. Agnes answered the door. Nora was at the kitchen table doing homework. She heard them talking in the front room, low voices, Agnes's measured and calm, his with a roughness that hadn't been there in the news interviews she'd seen. Then Agnes called her name. He looked different in their house, smaller somehow, not in a diminished way, but in the way that a person looks when they've stopped performing and are just present. There was a bruise still fading along his jaw. His hands, clasped in front of him, were the hands of a man who had spent time on boats, scarred at the knuckles, calloused along the palm. "I wanted to thank you properly," he said, "not through a press release, not with a check from a lawyer's office." He paused. "My daughter is 12. Nora didn't know what to do with that information, so she just looked at him. "Her name is Fiona," he said. She's had a hard couple of years. Her mother passed, and when I was missing, she was the one who insisted the police keep looking. She wouldn't let them scale back the search." He stopped, pressed his lips together. "She's the reason I'm standing here." Agnes offered him tea. He accepted it. They sat around the kitchen table, which had hosted almost every important conversation of Nora's life, and Graham Whitfield did something that surprised her. He listened. He asked Agnes about the nets, and he actually wanted to know. He asked Nora about school and didn't perform surprise at her answers. When she told him she was good at math, but the school's science resources were limited. They shared one working telescope between 4 classes. He nodded slowly. He came back the following Thursday, and the one after that. It was Agnes who understood first what was happening, the way Agnes always understood things that Nora was still assembling. One evening after Graham had gone, she sat in her chair by the window and said, without looking up from her mending, "He's lonely, that man, and he's grateful. Those are 2 different things, and he's got enough sense to know it." "What does that mean?" Nora asked. Agnes looked up then. Her eyes were the same gray-blue as the harbor. "It means he'll be careful about what he offers and why, which is a good sign. What Graham offered when he did was careful. A conversation first. With Agnes in the front room, with Nora present and included, not talked around. He had connections with the school board, he said. He'd been on an advisory committee for years. There was a science enrichment program being piloted in 3 Halifax schools. He thought, if Agnes was comfortable, if Nora wanted it, she might be a strong candidate for the expanded intake. Agnes asked 2 questions. Nora asked 4. He answered all of them without deflection. The program was everything the bait shop and the mended nets and the 2 large donated jacket had never been. A room full of equipment that actually worked. Teachers who had time to answer follow-up questions. Other kids who stayed late because they wanted to, not because they had nowhere else to go. Nora discovered that she had a particular aptitude for fluid dynamics. which made a kind of sense given that she had spent her whole life near water. She did not forget where she came from. She walked home to Connolly Street every evening. She mended nets with Agnes on Saturdays. She told Graham when he asked honestly what it was like. The adjustment, the moments of feeling out of place, the girl who had made a comment in the first week about her handwriting being different from everyone else's. He listened. He didn't try to fix it for her. That mattered. What neither of them spoke about, not directly for a long time, was the thing that had started to become quietly obvious to everyone around them. Agnes, Graham's assistant Daniel, even Fiona, who had come to Connolly Street once for dinner and had sat across from Nora for 3 hours. With an expression of cautious assessment that was so similar to her father's, it was almost funny. Graham had begun to care about Nora the way a person cares about someone they are responsible for, in the deepest possible sense. Not out of obligation, but out of recognition. As if something in him had identified something in her, and having identified it, couldn't look away. It was Fiona who named it first, because Fiona was 12 and had not yet learned to talk around things. "He thinks of you like a second daughter," she told Nora one afternoon on the dock behind Graham's house in Chester, where they had spent the day as what Graham had carefully called a low-key visit. He doesn't say it because he doesn't want to make it weird. But I can tell. Nora looked at the water. "Does it bother you?" Fiona considered the question with the same seriousness she considered everything. "No," she said finally. I think my dad collects people who are in trouble and then worries about them forever. I've watched him do it my whole life." A pause. "You just happen to also be the one who saved him." "I found him," Nora said. "That's different from saving him." "Is it?" Fiona said. The question that came later, the one that Graham raised first with Agnes, alone on a Sunday afternoon in February when the harbor was frozen solid and the bait shop's windows were fogged with cold, was the one that changed the shape of things. He was not trying to buy anyone, he said. He was not trying to replace anything. He was aware that he was a man with resources, asking a woman who had spent 30 years holding a family together with nets and grit to consider something that could look, from the outside, like charity. He wanted her to know that wasn't how he meant it. He wanted her to understand that what he was asking was not whether he could help Nora. He was going to help Nora either way, within whatever boundaries Agnes set, but whether Agnes would allow him to be, for lack of a better word, present, a second adult in Nora's life, not replacing Agnes, not trying to, just there. Agnes listened to all of this. Then she looked at him over her tea and said, "You understand that if you start, you can't stop. You understand what it would mean to that child if you started and then stopped." "Yes," he said. "And you've thought about it long enough." "I've thought about almost nothing else for 4 months, he said. Agnes set down her mug. "Then yes," she said, "on the condition that she has a say in everything, every decision. She's 11, nearly 12. She's not a package to be arranged." "Agreed," Graham said without hesitation. Nora, for her part, had known something was coming. She was good at reading the quality of silences, of the way adults moved around a subject. What she hadn't known was what she wanted. When Agnes told her what Graham had asked, she sat with it for a long time. Not days, she knew within hours, if she was honest. But she sat with it anyway, because it felt important to not rush. She thought about the container, the sound of someone trying to breathe, the rebar cold in her hands. The choice she hadn't made so much as move toward, the way you move toward a sound when your body understands something your mind is still catching up to. She thought about what it would mean, what it would cost, what it would ask of her, what it would give. She thought about Agnes's hands over hers at the kitchen table. "You did right." She went to Graham on a Saturday morning, while he was in Agnes's front room drinking his 3rd cup of tea and pretending to read a magazine. She stood in the doorway and waited until he looked up. "I want you to be there," she said, "for school things, and for other things too." He put the magazine down. His expression was careful, but his eyes were the same as they'd been in the container in those first seconds when the door swung open, that same relief that looked almost like grief. "I'll be there," he said, "and Fiona too. Fiona would be furious if she were excluded." Nora almost smiled. Okay, he said quietly. Agnes, from the kitchen, said nothing, but Nora heard the particular sound of the kettle being put on, the sound that, in their house, meant something was being marked, something being recognized. The year that followed was not uncomplicated. Graham's world was large and loud and had opinions about itself. There were dinners where Nora felt the gap between Connolly Street and Chester, like a physical thing. There were moments when well-meaning people said things that required Agnes's particular brand of quiet correction. There was a journalist who found out about the connection and tried to turn it into a story with a cleaner shape than the truth had, and Graham had handled that with a directness that surprised her. But there were also evenings at the kitchen table on Connolly Street, all four of them. Graham and Fiona added to the equation of Nora and Agnes, where the light came in off the harbor and the conversation went nowhere in particular, and Nora would look up from her textbook and see Graham listening to something Agnes was saying about the fishing co-op, and she would understand that this too was a kind of family. Not the kind that comes from blood or paperwork, the kind that comes from showing up, Thursday after Thursday, cup of tea in hand, in a listing house above a bait shop, because you want to be there and you can't imagine being anywhere else. One evening in March, after Graham and Fiona had gone, Nora found Agnes still at the table, her mending in her lap but her hands still. "Are you tired?" Nora asked. "A little," Agnes said. "Good tired." She looked at Nora. "You know what I think about sometimes? That October evening. You walking home. You taking the long way. I always take the long way." "I know." Agnes's voice was soft. "I used to worry about that. The long way home, the dark, the waterfront. I'd worry every time." She picked up her mending again. "I've stopped worrying about it." Nora sat down at the table. Outside, the harbor was dark and quiet. Somewhere a boat was coming in late, its running lights making two small spots of gold on the water. "Why?" she asked. Agnes looked up. Her eyes in the lamplight were very clear. "Because I watched you that evening. Not in person, I mean, in my head, the way I've imagined it 100 times. I watched you stop, listen, make the choice. And I understood something about you that I maybe already knew but hadn't put into words." "What?" "That you were always going to stop," Agnes said. "It wasn't bravery. It wasn't foolishness. It was just you. You were always going to stop and listen and try." She set down her mending for the last time that evening and reached across the table. "I stopped worrying about the long way home because I realized you were going to be fine. Not because nothing hard will ever happen, things will always happen, but because of who you are when they do." Nora didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Outside, the running lights moved slowly across the water, and the harbor exhaled against its banks, and the house on Connolly Street held them both in its listing, tired, absolutely reliable walls.